Let's get joined up. Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joinedup. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. So thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a regular show about all things writing, including interviews with authors, screenwriters, and key figures from the publishing industry, plus loads of hints, tips, and inspiration for all kinds of creatives. You can follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast, leave a quick iTunes review, or just tell a friend. Right, cue that cheesy theme tune.
Put down your pen and stop your typing. Grab yourself a drink, 'cause it's Joined Up Writing.
Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can and sometimes does go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 112 with debut mystery thriller writer Clare Empson. Claire's journey to publication is fascinating, and we talked about editing, rewrites, finding depth and dealing with rejection. Speaking of which, before we hear that interview, I wanted to talk a little bit again about rejection and give you an update on my continuing submissions journey. Bit of a coincidence, but the two seem to be going hand in hand at the moment. And as I record this, I've just returned from my holiday and I've had 3 more rejections for the novel. This takes me to 12 rejections so far, which is kind of neither here nor there. It's not a huge amount, I realise that. But I have had some very specific feedback from an agent I respect, and it has made me question whether I need to consider some bigger rewrites before I continue to submit. But I'm really torn about it, to be honest, because I think one of the main things potential agents and publishers have an issue with is the single first-person POV I've used for the whole novel, and the fact that the protagonist is a white male that uses some English slang. I mean, it's not loads of English slang, but there is a little bit of English slang in there. And this was one of the issues that the agent in question mentioned, because he's based in the US. But he also suggested I should have another POV, perhaps from the perspective of a female character or another younger black character that I've got in the book that's kind of quite a key character and would give it kind of a bit of a different spin. Now, this is obviously a huge change and would radically change the book. And I'm not sure how I feel about that, to be honest. So the agent did have positive things to say about my writing, and he did say he'd be happy to look at any new stuff, so that's pretty positive. But I do feel in a bit of a quandary now, because I do feel I'm relatively early in the submissions process. So should I plough on and gather more rejections and possibly more constructive feedback, or do I just put it all on hold, make some big changes and then resubmit? And that's not a small job. So has anyone out there had similar experiences? How did you approach it? I'd love to hear from you, so drop me a line at wayne@waynekellywrites.com or tweet me at MrKelly2U or at JU Podcast. I'd really love to hear from anybody that's had experience with this. It'd help me out and kind of get my head in the right place and give me some idea of how I should approach the next kind of coming weeks, months and whatever. And I also want to thank the brilliant Tony Schumacher for his help and support with all of this, and for sending me positive vibes last week when I have to admit I was feeling a bit sorry for myself and pretty down about the whole thing, and he sort of got me to pull myself together and be positive about it. So thanks for that, Tony, I appreciate it. Okay, on with the show and this week's interview with Clare Empson. So Claire worked as a staff writer on national newspapers, covering everything from collapsing merchant banks to tea with the late Barbara Cartland, until about 8 years ago when she moved to the West Country and founded the arts and lifestyle blog countrycalling.co.uk. The idyllic setting inspired her first novel, Him, which reveals the darker side of paradise and is out right now from everywhere you can buy books. She's a really interesting guest, and it was great to chat to Claire back in April. All right, Claire, thanks a million for joining me on Joined Up Writing. Really appreciate it. So, for a start, why don't you just tell us how things are and give us a sense of where you're actually speaking from this evening?
Oh, well, I'm in my house in Mere. I live in the middle of nowhere, literally. Brilliant. In the country. I've got 3 kids, quite grown up now, and my husband. They're all downstairs having roast chicken, which I'm missing out on.
Oh, I'm sorry. I appreciate you taking the sacrifice.
That's okay.
So why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about your debut novel, Him?
So it's been positioned as a psychological thriller, which it definitely is. But I would say first and foremost, it's more of a dark love story. And it's quite interesting because all the reviews are sort of saying it's a dark love story. It's about a woman called Catherine, and she's mute. And when it opens, she's in a psychiatric hospital. And you learn that she's seen something very traumatic and she's stopped speaking. But then the doctors say you've got to look into your past. So even though she's married and she's got 2 kids, it all goes back to Lucian and to this devastating affair she had 15 years before at university. So it's kind of told in 2 timelines. And there's her in the present day, and then there's actually they meet and they have all the same feelings for each other again 15 years later, and it's 15 years before. So it's quite a complex narrative.
It sounds like it. Yeah, it sounds like it would be quite a challenge to write.
It was. I mean, it's funny, but it took 9 years, and that is not me working flat out for 9 years, but obviously, but I think what happened was I had 3 sort of main characters. I had Catherine's husband, and I had Lucian and Catherine. And then I realised that it just had to be a love story, and I had to sort of slim it down into 2 narratives split between Catherine and Lucian. But actually, because Catherine's mute, to get her character and to understand how amazing she was 15 years ago, I had to put that 15 years ago timeline in. Yeah. So it kind of happened slowly over years, really.
You sort of found your way in.
I found my way in, yeah.
And so you've got like this split timeline. So how did you approach? So it sounds like you had your first timeline was kind of where you started, and then how did you slot that in? Did you kind of do it so everything was sequential in your mind when you were writing it? How did you kind of put the thing together, or was it a case of you were thinking, right, now I need this bit of the story, so we'll flick back and I'll slot this bit of the narrative in?
I suppose because I did sort of so many drafts, to start with, it was sequential. And then I was sort of slotting in another narrative. So, for example, the very last thing I wrote, which is my favourite, is the 15 years ago. And it's the love story of Catherine and Lucian before it all goes wrong. And that sort of slotted in. But when I was sort of doing the final drafts, I was always kind of working on it sequentially, if that makes sense.
Yeah, to kind of make it work and build it up as a story. Yeah, why don't you? Let's go back a little bit, and why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your background and kind of how you came to writing?
Okay, so I've always written. So when I was a child, I was that sort of typical child that was kind of covering notebooks and reading. I was a total bookworm, and it never really occurred to me that I would do anything other than write. And I went to university, did an English degree, and then I wanted to be a journalist, and that was what all I wanted to do. And so I did various local papers, and then I ended up working on at the Daily Express and the Mail on Sunday. And then around 30, I thought, oh my God, you have got to sit down and write a novel. And so that's where I started. And I wrote and I don't know, I got closer. I actually got picked up by an agent at Curtis Brown with really what I now know was a first draft. Yeah. And it went out to a few publishers, and then it got rejected, and actually she dropped me, and it was quite a big learning curve. So at that point in time, I'm like, you're going to have to take this more seriously. And I felt like I had to sort of really spend time learning how to craft the kind of book I like to read, which had emotion and depth. And it took me a long time to do that.
It must have been a strange journey in a way, because you say it sounds like initially you were picked up relatively quickly. So I suppose for a start, I suppose it was a little bit of a roller coaster, was it that? So you go from this being picked up very quickly, and then you get hit with the rejection afterwards. Because often when people are trying to submit novels and they're trying to get accepted, you hit the rejection is the first thing you hit. Usually, that's the kind of thing you normally have to go through lots and lots and lots of that before you get picked up, and then for you it was kind of the other way around.
Yeah, I think it was, and it was incredibly harsh. But I don't mind at all now, because I think had that book got published, it wouldn't have been anything like the book I finally wrote. And I really convinced that I probably maybe might have written one novel, but I don't think I'd have had a career writing in that way. It was kind of it was fine, but it was just a little bit more lightweight. So I think I did just have to go back to the drawing board. But one thing I did was I formed a writers group with 2 other writers. I didn't know them very well, but I just discovered that they'd been on a short story writing course, and that was absolutely fantastic. And so we all had really young kids at the time, but we committed to meeting every single week and whenever we could, and we would always write a new scene and we'd read it out, which was terrifying, but it was amazing to have that kind of audience, and also just to have those people who were going through the same highs and lows. And one of the things, certainly that's something that I think is why I took so long, is because I used to sabotage scripts I was writing on, and I'd go, yeah, it's not working, and then I'd start another one.
Yeah.
And that's just a classic thing, isn't it? But I really did that so much. And these friends in the writers group, they just would not let me do that. And they were like, nope, that idea sounds good. You can write that for book 2.
Yeah. And so they kind of force you to realise that it's all about getting it out, getting it down, that first draft, that ugly first draft. It's like get it onto the page and then edit it.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because I love the editing process now, and rewriting is what I like, and the first draft is what I hate. But it took me so long to sort of understand that really you just got to motor through it and get down the plot, and then the nicer bits come later. So yes, definitely.
I suppose in a way it's strange that you, as you say, that I know it's completely different type of writing. Well, coming from a journalism background, presumably you were kind of, in one way, you were used to, getting a story down quickly, going through, editing it, and then having it edited again, and you having to cut down or do to a certain amount of words. So why do you think it was so different when it came to the writing of the novel?
Do you know what I think it is? I think because I remember doing the first draft of him when I was now in the writers group. I remember giving it to my friends, and they were like, "Yeah, it's great, but it could have more depth." And I sort of didn't know what that meant. And actually, what I think it means is writing from the heart. And I think that you have to be prepared to expose bits of yourself that you maybe didn't want to. And when you're a journalist, you're writing about everyone else, and it's fine. And actually, putting your own sort of thoughts onto the page, which is what basically gives it authenticity. I think I found that hard, and it took me a long time to learn how to do it. And to be sort of comfortable with it.
Yeah. As you say, it's making yourself vulnerable, isn't it?
That's exactly it. Yeah.
And on that subject, so I know within the novel, obviously, you tackle some big issues, including living with extreme OCD, which I think you've had personal experience of yourself. So give us a sense of how that manifested itself, and how you came to be able to write about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much in the novel actually, but just what is in the novel is as a theme of trapped grief, and both Catherine and Lucian lose a parent when they're young. It's a really beloved parent, and that's something that happened to me. I lost my mother when I was at university, and what happened, I was living 500 miles away from home. I sort of couldn't really deal with it or talk about it, and nor could my friends. And then over many, many years, I just became completely and utterly unable to talk about it. And eventually I got help with that, and I had bereavement therapy, which was life-changing. But it also really changed my writing, because I sort of fed into the story this theme of trapped grief. And I think it gave it an authenticity that hadn't been there before. And maybe sort of facing something quite painful made me more able to do that in my writing. And with book 2, the same thing. And it's not so personal to me, book 2, but I think I understand how to connect with those thoughts and feelings which you maybe try to avoid, I say.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think over a period of time, with such a long gestation of the book and being able to get it to where you want it to be, is it fair to say that you sort of see writing now as some form of therapy? I know you're not technically speaking writing about yourself, but as you say, you're digging within yourself to write these things.
Oh, I mean, just 100%. I think it really is a way of what I hadn't realised actually until him was out, was what a journey of self-exploration the whole book was. And even when I was writing it, I didn't understand that. And it was only once I started talking about it that I realised that you really are connecting with your innermost thoughts. And it's quite hard to access those thoughts, because we're all so busy, aren't we? And we're sort of scrolling through Snapchat and Twitter, and it's very easy to kind of let your life go past a bit of a blur. So writing helps you to explore those things. That's what I would say. And also actually being in my writers group, that was quite therapeutic as well. We all said the same thing. You know, we would sort of end up talking, because you reveal quite a lot about yourself when you're writing, and you've already gone through that barrier with your friends and your writers group. So actually, you know, we talked about some pretty deep stuff, and I found that really therapeutic.
And do you think there's an element? I mean, obviously you became friends with the people that you had your writing group with over a period of time, but essentially when you sort of start these things, it's often with strangers or people that you've not met before. Because I've been part of a critique group as well myself, and as you say, over a period of time you get to know them as people, but you also kind of get to know each other through writing. Because I find with the critique group that I'm a part of, that because the nature of it, we'll often, and there are a few of us that kind of see each other outside of the writing group, but a lot of times there's the people in that you only see them in the writers group, and you kind of learn about them through their writing, even though it's all fiction, or most of it's fiction, and you kind of get a sense of kind of their interior lives, don't you, at the same time?
Yes, you definitely do. And actually, I've started renting an office which has no Wi-Fi and no phone signal with two. I know, it's just desperate measures. With two other writers, but I didn't know them before we started renting together, and it's been really interesting getting to know them as well. And I think what I would say is that there is something about writers, maybe because you're exposing yourself, maybe because you're delving deep, that you do have a connection, don't you? I think there's something about people who are prepared to put their thoughts down and share them that gives you a stronger connection.
I think so. And I think to a certain extent, you often, I mean, speaking personally, you often expose certain parts of yourself more to people that aren't your family and aren't the closest people, because it's somehow, I don't know, whether it's safer or whether I don't know why it is, or whether, as you say, whether it's because they're other creatives and you think they might understand or whatever, but you often end up kind of exposing more than you would with some of your closest family, don't you?
I think that's really true. In my writers group, we used to say we told each other everything. And actually, because we all live in a community down here, in the sense that, you know, we're all in close by villages and everybody knows everybody, there's a lot of stuff that you wouldn't say to anybody else. And it was kind of amazing to be able to say it to them. But we used to bump into each other at parties. We'd say it was a bit like bumping into a lover, because we wouldn't look at each other. It's like, my God, I know so much about you.
Yeah.
But yes, I think it's true that you do connect more.
And what about the actual process of, in terms of the critique, and you said about reading out there and stuff like that, do you, I mean, obviously you don't want you to give away spoilers of the book or anything like that, but do you remember, was there like an epiphany, was there like a specific moment or a scene or a chapter or something that you wrote where it clicked for the first time in that way, and you thought, hang on, this is something different, I'm touching on this thing that they keep talking about, this depth?
Gosh, I can't think that there's that, but I think what I would say is that one of the characters, so there's Lucian, who's someone described the book as Brideshead Revisited meets Big Little Lies, which I've sort of pinched as my elevator pitch.
Yeah, it's great.
Because it's great. And there's a very sort of Brideshead element, in the sense that Lucian comes from this really privileged background, and he's surrounded by this tight-knit group of friends, whereas Catherine comes from a much simpler sort of suburban background, and she has a really wholesome life. But I do remember Lucian's quite a sort of attractive character, I would say, and I remember writing this scene with him, and my friend Harry sent me a sort of email afterwards, and she said that was a great session, blah blah blah, and P.S. can I have Lucian's phone number? And I'm like, I think I've got it. I think I've got
you
him.
Brought him to life.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So when you started the actual kind of querying again for the second time, how did that feel, having had the experience that you'd had before, which, to be honest, it almost sounds quite traumatic, because it's kind of, as I say, it's kind of different to usual, because usually you kind of get hardened to it by the fact that you've gone through all the rejection and then you get accepted, and by the time you get accepted, you're like, well, I'm used to it now, I've had all this rejection. But you kind of had this kind of relatively quick acceptance, and then, you know, it was like, well, actually, we lied, we don't want it anymore. Or yeah, I know it wasn't quite like that, but you know what I mean, you kind of got dropped.
It did feel like that.
Yeah, it must have been quite painful, I would have thought, at the time. I know you're a journalist, and as you say, you're kind of used to submitting things and whatever, but I should imagine this was a bit different, because it probably felt more personal, did it?
it felt personal. It felt brutal, and I think I lost a huge amount of confidence in myself and my writing. So that's why the writers group was brilliant. Second time around, which was 9 years later, I basically only went through people that I knew, and I sort of got a hit list of agents that I had connections to through other people, and and that's how I went for it. And actually, I was really lucky. The one I really wanted came back and said, and she just had read the submission and she said, send the rest in. And then she said, I really like it. This is what I think it needs. Does that chime with you? And her ideas were fantastic. And that was it, really. So I didn't have to go through too much rejection and the submission process. I was quite lucky again.
The second time, that's good. Well, but you kind of paid your dues, to be fair, though. 9 years.
I paid my dues, and also 9 years, yeah. And I also I should say, one thing I did, which I think made a huge difference, was I hired an independent editor, and she'd been recommended to me by someone at Penguin, and I think that was brilliant for getting the book into shape. So
that is interesting, yeah.
I wouldn't need it now, but at that time it was quite a complex story. It has this kind of these threads. So it was amazing having that. It was money well spent, I would say.
And what sorts of things did they help you with that initial thing? Was it predominantly structural stuff?
It was structure. It was character, and so, for example, I think I said to you earlier, originally there were always three. There's Sam, the husband, Catherine's husband, who's always in love with her, and then Catherine's in love with Lucian, and Catherine and Sam. So there were three voices, and she said, I'm going to advise you to get rid of Sam because it's too complicated, and she shouldn't be in love with two people. So that was a huge structural change, but I think it made a real difference, and also it meant that I knew Sam very, very well. So even though he didn't have his own voice, I think hopefully that came through.
Yeah, because you'd kind of done the groundwork already.
And actually the other big thing that she said was I'd put in the hospital scenes, but they were at the beginning and the end, like a sort of prologue and an epilogue. And she suggested that I scattered more hospital scenes through the book. So I guess that was quite a big narrative change, which I think really sort of gave it more strength.
And how did you feel when you first started getting some of those edits back? I mean, as I say, you're a journalist, so you're probably used to working with editors, but were you resistant to any of the changes? Did it feel like, oh my God, this is, a really big job ahead of me?
Do you know, I've absolutely loved it. It's funny. I almost prefer it. And so with Felicity, my agent, I did a big edit for her, and I thought her suggestions were fantastic. And then with Francesca, my editor at Orion, again, she sort of just connected with the story, and I've just finished book 2 actually, and again, I found being edited brilliant, because almost every time I think the suggestions are good, and if they're not, it's absolutely fine to talk about it. A couple of times I've sort of said, no, I don't want to do that, but generally speaking, I've just found it really, really helpful.
Yeah, that's great. And so you mentioned book 2 a couple of times there. So is that a follow-on or is it a standalone?
It's a standalone. I would say it's quite similar in style. It's a completely different story. It's actually it's a book about adoption. It's the story of a reunion between a birth mother and her long lost son. That they meet after when he's 27. And what happens is that he invites her into his life to become a nanny to his baby, because and it all goes horribly wrong, basically. But it is similar in the sense that there are two timelines. There's the present day, and then there's 1970s, and that's this kind of very, very passionate love affair. So I suppose if people like him, then hopefully they'll, there is a similar kind of strength of passion there. I quite like writing love stories, but very dark ones.
Yeah, yeah. And how did you find, I mean, presumably anything's easier than the first book in terms of how long you had to work on it and the amount of work and your kind of journey, but how did you find writing book 2 compared to book 1?
Well, I was just going to say it was a complete nightmare, actually. Basically, I don't know what it is, but I can be quite chaotic, and I didn't really look at the contract. And basically, I'd sort of thought, oh, I've got a while to do book 2. And I think it was March last year, I'd finished book 1. That was all very exciting. I was doing some gentle research, having a lovely time, kind of, because there's quite a lot of art in the book. So I've been talking to artists and stuff. And then this email came in. It was from my agent to my editor saying, just checking on Claire's deadline for book 2. And the response came straight back, and it was 1st of August 2018. And this was in March. It was just complete nervous breakdown. So basically, I managed to get 2 more months, but it was hell. And I think hence The Office without Wi-Fi, because then my teenage kids came home and suddenly the house was like a party zone, and I was going nuts. So I actually shipped out to a friend's house to sort of finish that first draft. It was very stressful, but now I think it's quite good working like that. I don't know. I think a happy in between.
Yeah, it was probably, as you say, it was probably more of a case of that you just hadn't quite realised it was just sort of probably felt like it sort of came out of the blue.
Well, I think having taken so long and then having to do it in less than a year felt, to me, I mean, it's crazy because I see people all the time on Twitter and they're saying just done their draft in 8 weeks. And I'm like, wow, how do people do that?
I know, when people talk about 2 and in some cases 3 books a year and things, I know.
I just do not know how they do it. But for me, no way.
So how do you what's your process like in terms of, so let's say with book 2 you came up with an idea for book 2 or whatever, how did you approach it? Do you think, right, I'm going to map out the story now, I'm going to plot it, or I'm going to just sit down, I've got an idea for this initial scene, or I'm going to sketch out the characters? Talk me through that.
Yeah, so I'm definitely the pantser, I think. But I'm trying to change. So
everybody says that.
Do they?
Everybody that's a pantser always wants to change to be a plotter. And I count myself in that.
What are you?
I'm a pantser, but I'd like to be able to plot.
Yeah. Well, basically, with book 2, I've always had the idea. I got the idea in the middle of book 1, which is exactly what I've done with book 2. But I think it's kind of procrastination, basically. But I knew exactly what the story was and where it was going. And I tried to write myself a big synopsis, and in the end, I just had to sit down and write it. Mm-hmm. But I am trying with book 3 to do an outline. But who knows whether that will work.
But why do you think that is? What do you think you'll gain from doing the outline? Because, as I say, it's something that a lot of us, me included, say. But for you, what appeals to you about that?
Well, I can sort of almost tell you more what doesn't appeal to me. I'm sort of worried about getting bored because I don't like knowing what I have to do. Mm-hmm. It's like that's probably the bit, not necessarily editing, but when you've got to write a scene and you don't really want to write it.
Yeah.
And so you try and write anything but that scene. And then usually what I do in that situation is I get rid of that scene because I'm like, well, if I'm never going to be able to make it good enough. Mm-hmm. So that's probably why I don't want to do it. But it's just mainly, or maybe it's insecurity. It's because I keep reading all these books saying how much better everything is if you plot it and you know where your conflict is and all these things which slightly make me go cold inside. But I suppose I think I ought to do them. So I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, I've gone, like I say, I go through, I sort of flip-flop from one to the thinking that from one thing to the other. But I think of late I've come to the conclusion that I think whatever works for you, whatever your process is, and everybody's completely different, then just embrace it and go with it. I think the problem with a lot of it comes from fear, as you say. It's like an insecurity thing. It's this constant feeling of thinking maybe it would be easier if I did it the other way or whatever. But I think, to tell you the truth, I don't think it is easy. I think whichever way you do it, it's difficult. Yeah. It's hard to write books, and I think
it is hard.
I mean, I think either way you kind of have to do. I think you either put the thinking time. I think basically you either put it up front or you put it at the back. And I think people that plan, they still must have to go through all that planning and the deep thought process before they start writing. Whereas I think people that pants it, they're almost working through and they're thinking about it as they go along. And then where they really find out what the story is and really which bits need to work or whatever changes is in the edit, really. you know.
I think that's true. And also I would say I am definitely a thinker. And, because of this self-sabotage thing that I have, where when I'm in the middle of one book, I just get a brilliant idea for the next book. And that's just, do you do that? Yeah. So therefore, all the time I'm writing that book that I'm disliking, I'm thinking about the book that I really, really want to write. So I've done a lot of the heavy lifting before I get to it. But I would say I was just what you're saying. It's so hard to take your own advice, isn't it? But being in this office with these two writers, and they're both writing first novels, and obviously I've been through that, and they've been despairing and complaining, and sometimes enjoying it, but a lot of the time, and I'm like, that is what it is. That is what it's like. It's really, really hard, but it's still. When it's you still, it's hard to take that advice, isn't it?
I think it is.
We have not chosen an easy path, have we?
No, I don't think so. I think it's I don't know whether you're the same, but I think I find the way that I do it is I do end up having to throw away a lot of words, or at least, park them. Nothing's wasted, I suppose. But, and going down, and I do go down, in some instances, I do go into cul-de-sacs and write myself into a corner with that and think, no, that was the wrong decision that I took sort of 10 chapters ago, and now I need to go back and work out how that's going to do. And a lot of that, as you say, comes in the editing, but I've also had it during the first draft. Sometimes I come up with what I think's a great idea in the moment, and I follow it through, and then discover that actually I've made things incredibly difficult for myself, and it's not going to work out how I wanted it to work out. So I think it's from that, but I just think it's, as I say, I just think it's the process. And I think half the problem is the resistance that you feel whilst you're doing it. Whereas if you could embrace it. I mean, I was listening to a podcast recently. I don't know whether you listened to it. It's called The Rule of Three.
No.
It's good. It is a writer's podcast, but it's slightly different because it's two comedy writers. Joel Morris and I can't remember the other guy's name. Yeah, and they'll have a guest on, and the guest will talk about. It'll be something to do with comedies. It might be a sitcom, it might be a comedy record, it might be a comedy film or something like that. They're all comedy based, and they'll have a writer on, and then they kind of dissect it. And they'll talk about all the things they like or whatever. But they had Aisling Bea on, and she was talking about Father Ted. But before they got into Father Ted, they got into this whole conversation about creatives and the guilt that you feel as a creative about not having a proper job. Not as in not having a proper job, but not approaching what you do as a proper job, in inverted commas, in the fact that this idea that you clock in at 9 o'clock and you clock out at 5 o'clock, and you do all you have to do in that period of time and all that kind of thing, and it's very productive and it's very well ordered. And Aisling Bea was sort of saying that is rubbish. This idea of this proper job. Yeah, there are proper jobs that you do need to go to an office at this time of the day, and you go and do this, and everything's well ordered, and you produce a certain amount of stuff every day. But most of the creative things happen. It can happen at any time, and it usually does. I don't know whether you're the same, but it's usually as I'm falling asleep, or as I'm waking up, or as I'm in the shower, or something like that, or I'm in the middle of doing something else that's completely different. And I get the idea, but you're constantly thinking about it. The truth of the matter is, even when you think you're not thinking about it, you are thinking about it in the back of your mind.
I think that's completely true. And actually, with him, I was quite an erratic sleeper, and quite often I find myself awake at 3 or 4, and I would just, as my sort of safe space, I would think about Catherine and Lucian. And now I do it with, every book. It's like, it's actually almost a pleasure to be awake. I know it sounds ridiculous, but you can kind of do a lot of your plotting at that time, or thinking about it.
Yeah, because there's not really any distractions.
It's true. So I think that is really true. I think you do. The only downside of that, and I think my children would testify to this, is that you are only half present quite a lot of the time.
Oh, yes.
I mean, my kids are like, what did I say?
Yeah,
and I can answer on autopilot. I actually once did it with my daughter, and she'd had this very drastic haircut, and we were driving back from the hairdressers, and I was obviously thinking about some plot twist. And she said, I think I look like a boy. And I went, yeah, you do. Went down really badly.
Yeah, I've done very similar things, yeah. Yeah, and it's just, they'll just sort of say, you didn't hear what I said, did you? And I'm like, no, I'm really sorry, I didn't. And they're like, why? Oh, it's just I'm thinking about this thing I was just working on earlier on, and I think I'm really struggling with it, and I can't get my head around it, or whatever, or I think I might have just solved it, or whatever.
But we're working, so it's okay.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it is difficult. It is one of those things you can't clock in and clock out. I think that's the thing with it. I think once you start working on something, or one or more things or whatever, and you plant the seed that's in the back of your mind, and then it just starts growing on its own, and who knows when it's going to come, when it's going to flower or whatever, to carry on this twisted metaphor. But when it's going to come out, and you're going to solve the thing that you're working on, or you're going to come out with a new idea or whatever. But when I'm in that kind of mood and I am working on something, it's almost like an obsession, really.
Oh, completely. What I actually feel, I don't know if you're the same, but it's like having just finished book 2, I can't believe that I've got headspace again. And also, but when you're in it, you don't realize you haven't got any headspace, because all you're really thinking about is the book. You're living in another world. It's so strange, isn't it? When you come out the other side, it's strange. I'm like, oh, right, there you are. And, I can do this, and I can do it. It's extraordinary.
And there's that thing as well when you start, I mean, if you're like me as well, if you pants, so like I fairly recently started my book 1's out on submission at the moment, and I've started book 2, and I came up with an idea for the opening scene, which might be the opening scene. You know what it's like. By the time I edit it, it might not be, but at the time it was the first thing that I wrote, and I started it off, and you're full of adrenaline and excitement and this brand new thing, and you're kind of heading off, and you can go in any direction and everything else, and you sort of forget that when you're halfway through first draft of a book or whatever. You forget that feeling, and it's great when you first start, but that come sort of a couple of months down the line, you're going to be longing for that feeling that you had when you first started, and it was all fresh before you made it all complicated, and you weren't quite sure where you were heading and what was going to happen, and
that's it.
Things.
People often say, I see people saying, I think it's true, 30,000 words in, it's about a third, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you sort of hit a wall.
Yeah.
And actually it becomes, isn't it awful, because it becomes boring for a bit, and you think, oh, I'm so bored, even though it's such a privilege to do it.
Yeah, completely, yeah. Because you're just finding your way. It's that middle, that whole, big section in the middle of the book that you kind of got to find, make your way from the beginning to the end sort of thing.
Yeah, that's why I think the edits are so much better, because it's just, I think that you get this idea and you think it's fantastic, and then you sit down to write it, and your characters start out being quite two-dimensional.
Yeah.
And you have to keep on editing, don't you? And then finally that story that you first imagined comes out. But it's quite hard graft getting there, I think.
It is, yeah. And I think, if you just, that's the only danger, I think. There are some authors that, they will just absolutely brutally plot everything out point by point, and they can do it before they start writing, and not all of them that are like that, but I know that are people, especially people that write in, say, certain kinds of thrillers or whatever, and they've kind of got this template that they, as far as they're concerned, it works, and it's a formula, and they can just transpose it and pop it onto the top of whatever and just run with it, and that's fine, but it never feels as real as it could. The characters never feel as real to me. I love that genre, and when it's done right, it's brilliant. But if you're not careful, I think you can just have, well, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and this happens, and
I think you're right, and actually it would bore me to write like that, even though I admire people who can.
Me too, yeah.
I just think you need to be surprised by your characters, don't you? Because that's when it's exciting, in a way.
It is, and I think it's that laziness thing. I definitely do it sometimes in my first draft. As you say, when you get really in the woods and in the thick of it, and things are getting tricky, and you've set up a load of bad things to happen to your main character or characters, and you just find yourself sometimes just solving it, or something really convenient happens, and that's sorted that thing out, and you can move on to the next thing. It's only when you, either in the edit or a little bit further into the first draft, you think, hang on a minute, that was just really, really convenient, and it was a bit lazy. It was, it was a bit like,
that's so true.
Because I don't really want to write my way out of that, or think about, it gets messy. It's like, what would happen if they didn't do that, or they couldn't do that, or it didn't go how they wanted it to go? Well, it gets messy then, and one or two the fork in the road that's got like 1 or 2 roads off it suddenly got 6 roads off it, and it's like, which one do I take and where's that going to lead? And which should be the way that you should write it, because that makes it interesting and exciting, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Yeah, we're pantsers, aren't we? That's it.
Yeah, that's it. Just embrace it.
Well, I'm happy now because I'm not going to have to write my outline.
There you go.
You've talked me out of it. It's perfect. You can start book 3 tomorrow.
I mean, I've spoken to people that are pantsers, and they say about when they get they get a deal and they've got to say, well, my book 3 or my book 4 or whatever it is, and the publisher will often say, well, we need an outline for what your book 3 is before you start it. And I've spoken to some of them, and they will just literally say, well, I'll just give them an outline. But I don't think that's probably not what it's going to be. They'll just give them, they'll just go, well, I'll come up with something quickly. That's fine. Just so I'll give them an outline. I'll give them the premise, because they've normally got, obviously you've got the premise, and you set your characters up, whatever, and they kind of almost phrase it. And well, this will probably happen, and there's going to be some conflict here, and that will lead, and then they just sort it out when they're writing it anyway, and they don't worry about it too much. But it's being able to be that kind of blasé about it, I suppose. But I think it is this idea that just that you'll sort it out, your process. You did it before, especially I suppose as you get. I mean, obviously you're working on book 2 now, but when you're on book 3 or book 4 or whatever, hopefully you remember that you've done it a couple of times before.
I'm about to start book 3, and I, as always, I'm incredibly excited about the idea, and I think it's going to be fantastic. But I know maybe the outline is a way of putting it off, because I know that I'm going to get into that first draft and I'm going to because it's just difficult. But I've seen other people saying, when there are a few books in, it's never any easier. Yeah. It's just maybe you can't, you can do it. I guess maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you know that you can do it, so you've kind of probably got a little bit more confidence, but it's not going to be any easier.
And also, do you know what I think it is? Which is hence my office. I think it's turning up, isn't it? It's turning up and doing it. Is 3/4 of the battle.
Completely, and it's accepting that. I've written about it myself, like on my blog and different bits and pieces, and I've spoken to lots of people that kind of feel the same. Self-doubt in general.
Yeah.
It can be absolutely crippling, because you just think to yourself as you're writing it, you're either comparing it to something else or whatever, and you're just thinking, this is just rubbish. It's absolute rubbish. Even if you're comparing it to something else that you've written in the draft, I've done that before. I'm just thinking, well, this is nowhere near as good as chapter 3 or whatever it is. This is just not the same standard. This is rubbish. This is really flat. And that might be true, but I've often found that when I get to the edit, it's often not true anyway. It's the same sort of standard. It needs an edit, but it's not particularly any worse than anything else in the book that needs an edit or whatever. And if it is, then you can sort it out in the edit anyway. As you say, I mean, I quite like the edit as well, because the thing's there. It's ready to sort of unearth and polish up and sort it out. The hardest thing is getting the bloody thing down on the paper in the first place.
That is the hard thing. I'm really intending to motor through the first draft for book 3, just because I know it's hideous, and I'm just like, just get the thing done.
I think that's definitely right. I mean, it's kind of a recurring theme when I speak to people on here, but for me, again, I've gone through in the past with things where I'll go back, I'll write a chapter, and then the next day I'll go back and I'll look at the chapter and I'll edit it, or I'll critique it in my mind or whatever. And it's just absolute, for me anyway, it's just absolute death. I've spoken to people that they love to do that, and they can't move on without knowing that the pages that they wrote yesterday are sort of in a decent shape. But to me, it just absolutely kills the momentum. For me, I have to get some momentum going, and that's what's good about things like NaNoWriMo or whatever, where you National Novel Writing Month. That is the good side of it. If you've got an idea and you just want to get stuff down, and you have got this thing of, I've got to write this amount of words every single day, and it doesn't really matter if they're crap, and it sort of gives you permission to write crap. And I think that's kind of what you have to do yourself, because you can sort it out. No one else has to see it.
I think it is. I mean, I learned that with book 2, and I was in agony because, of course, book 1 had been through so many edits, and I was pretty happy with it. And then I get to writing book 2, but up against this really tight deadline, and I felt I was writing pants totally. But I just had to carry on, and it was a really big lesson. But actually, then of course, what I did was I did another rewrite before what I officially called first draft, which went out, and it was fine. It was much better. And actually, also, it's the self-critical thing, isn't it? Because I put it away for a week, and when I came back to it, it was not too bad. It's like
for definite, yeah. And I love that thing that it does happen occasionally when you do the you go through the read through before you start editing it, and you're pleasantly surprised. There's some bits that you almost forgot that you wrote.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, this bit's actually quite good.
It's very hard to keep a whole book in your head, isn't it? That's where I'm jealous. I'm jealous of the plotters and the people with the diagrams and the maps. Because
I totally agree with that. Yeah, I'm exactly the same. I mean, I do forget things. I do.
Yeah, me too. Probably you'll say I'll fail at this, but I'm going to try Scrivener. Do you do Scrivener?
Oh, I do. Oh, I love Scrivener.
And you do?
Scrivener,
okay.
And Scrivener is a great idea, and it's a great idea. Well, I think it's a great idea whether you plot or whether you pants or whatever. One of the best things about it, and I was talking to Nikki Mackay about this. Well, I spoke to her last night, but I spoke to her about it before. She's just started Scrivener, but when I was trying to convince her to use Scrivener, one of the best things about it is, especially when you start your edit, is, I don't know whether you write in scenes or whether you write in chapters or how you break your work up. I tend to think in chapters, and because I write fairly short chapters. But what you can do in the edit is you can just, because you're writing these as separate documents within a document, you can just grab a scene or a chapter or whatever and just move it. Just drag it down. You don't have to copy and paste. You don't have to do it like that. And the other thing with it is as well, you can sort of retrospectively sort of outline from the point of view that you can go into each little mini document and you can sort of write a few lines about what happens in the chapter.
That's what I think would be so helpful.
Which I know you can do, manually, and you can write them on. I've done that as well when you write it on cards and all that kind of thing. But I went through the whole thing of writing however many dozens of cards and writing on these things. Then the practicalities of actually laying it out and do it, I just don't find it any easier than doing it digitally, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm with you on that completely. But I'm very hopeful in that case because I've got Scrivener. I haven't looked at it yet, but I'm going to go with it. Everybody says it's a good thing.
It's good. The thing that you'll find, don't be sort of scared by it, because when you first open it and you first have a look at it, you probably will be intimidated just because... Mm-hmm. Just because it's just completely different to Word. It's just completely different in some respects when you first open it up. But the actual writing part of it is brilliant. When you're actually just writing and you're drafting, I forget what they call the mode or whatever, but you just click a button and the whole screen becomes the page, and it's got like this typewriter mode or something it's called, and basically your cursor always stays in the middle of the screen. A typewriter, so everything just keeps going up. So like when you're writing on Word, you basically fill the page and you kind of have to keep scrolling up and whatever. It will always do that, so you stay in the middle. And that sounds like a really trivial thing, but it's actually quite nice when you're writing. And there's all the word count things and the target and everything else on there. But yeah, just from the point of view of breaking it down into little bits and then being able to look at it easily and drag things around, and the other thing that I use loads, there's I have I make separate documents for characters and things.
Oh yeah.
So if I come up with a character, and as you do when you're in the first draft, you'll obviously just come up with a character name off the top of your head, and you start making things up in the moment, and you just, I'll sort this out later, I'll just get them in the scene and I'll write it. But again, you can just make another document as you do it, quickly write their name. And again, you've got you can have a little folder called characters. Well, you can make whatever folders you like. You can have a folder that says plot lines or
setting or
whatever you want, you can have in there. And it's great because, again, I'll be halfway through the draft and I think, what did I call the landlady that was in chapter 6? I can't even remember what her name was, let alone what she looked like. So again, you can put that in there, what she looked like or how old she was or whatever, and it just speeds everything up so that you can just quickly flick over to it and go, oh right, yeah, I remember now, she's that age, she looks sort of like that, right, that's fine. And then I'll just carry on writing and drop back into the story. So yeah,
well, that does sound fantastic.
It's brilliant. It's really good, and you can probably find a couple of things if you if you go on YouTube, you'll probably be able to find like a quick introductory thing that will kind of get you into it. But yeah, it's kind of for a start you'll think it's more complicated than it is, but it's not really.
Okay.
You just crack on with it. So yeah, it's definitely worth a bit of investment in the time. And you can export it and do whatever you want with it, afterwards in terms of whether you want it to be a Word thing or you want it to be. And you can. The only thing I think a lot of authors say is that when you're doing sort of track changes and things, they'll often still do that in Word, and then transfer it back over to Scrivener, because a lot of editors and people are still not using Scrivener.
Okay, but is it easy to transfer over to Word?
It is, because you can it's got this thing called compile, but basically it's like exporting or saving as. You can save it as PDFs, you can save it as a Word file. Perfect. Or a rich text file or whatever you want. And the same goes for like importing things. I mean, you can do if you self-publish or whatever, you can export Kindle files and all sorts of different things from it. It can be as sort of complicated as you want it to be. But yeah, just in terms of writing and get it out. And I've got like a file where if I cut stuff from the manuscript when I'm editing, I just drag, rather than having to delete it and save it as a new version or whatever, I just grab it and drag it into, I've got like a unused from draft 1 or unused from draft 2 or whatever, and I'll just drag it into that bin. And then if at some stage I think, no, actually I could do with some stuff out of that original scene, I can just take it back out and add it back into the manuscript. So it's great. That sounds
brilliant. Okay, well, I hope I'm going to be able to get my head around it.
You will. I'm sure you will. And if you want, just drop me an email. And if you've got any questions, I'll glad to give you a hand. So.
Oh, thank you, Wayne.
That's great. That's really good. So why don't you, just as we kind of wrap things up, so just remind people of when and how they can get their hands on him and find out a little bit more about you as well.
Yeah, so it's out with Orion. The best place to get it is Amazon. It's just come out as a paperback, and it's also on Kindle. And I've got my own author page, which is clareempson.com, which talks about, although I'm talking at various festivals and things like that, so I put all my events up there.
Oh, brilliant. Well, I'll put a link to all that stuff in the show notes. Obviously, book 2 is in process as well. Have you got any idea of when that's coming out? Is that next year or later this year?
It's actually coming out in August.
Brilliant.
So yeah, I know. So that's exciting. So with Orion, they do the trade paperback thing first, and then the mass paperback comes out in April next year, April 2020.
Oh, brilliant. Well, congratulations on him. And it's been
Thank you.
Really good to talk to you. So thanks a million, Claire.
You too, Wayne. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks again to Claire, and do make sure you check out Him, which is out right now. I'll put all of those links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. That's it for this week, but don't forget you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever else you get your podcasts to have the show downloaded automatically every week. Also remember to get in touch with all your writing news, views, questions or comments, and tweet me about anything you like, actually, and I'll give you a mention in a future show. So look out for the next episode when I'll be chatting to crime writer K.H. Irvin. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing and reading, and I'll see you next time.
Joined up.